want me to?
You do it. You do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, I kind of threw this at you as far as, oh, this might be an interesting because it's not very long, the short story.
Right.
It's 20 odd pages or so, but it's, I think, kind of a small microcosm of a lot of Dostoevsky's stories or a lot of his themes.
Absolutely.
Uh, I'm sure you'd agree with that. And I've kind of been in that headspace a little bit because I've been reading some of the novellas and stuff as of late. But it's kind of a nice, just a little piece and then take from it where you will. But it's The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, short story by Fyodor Dostoevsky, written in 1877. So right around the tail end of his life, I believe he only lives for 4 more years before um, that's kind of the window of time.
Oh, wow.
So it's right near the end of his life. It was first published in a writer's diary of his, and basically, to summarize the story, you've got the narrator, the ridiculous man. People call him a madman, and he's essentially an outsider from society in a lot of ways. He is someone that basically determines early on in the story that nothing makes a whole ton of difference. There's nothing really real or tangible, and that even in arguments, there's nothing really. Oh, I think the things don't make any difference at all is the line or something along that chance. So he decides he's going to kill himself. He's going to end it all. Tonight's the night he sees a star, and tonight's the night. Before he does so, though, there is a encounter with a young girl, which is really a very it's kind of gut wrenching because this girl is in very obvious distress. She is screaming and tugging, and the descriptions of her are that she could be very poor. She's very shabbily dressed. The evening itself is, her clothing doesn't fit the conditions. But he gets quite upset with her and basically tells her to get away from me.
Yeah.
I don't want any part of it. And then and that just naturally transitions into him going home and then eventually having this dream, which is, I would say, some sort of like enlightenment type of dream or some sort of consciousness raising dream where he believes he does kill himself, but then what happens? There's a afterward that he encounters some sort of god-like figure who takes him up into the heavens, and then he is transported back to this earth-like place, and he describes the love and the beauty of life and everything. And from there, he goes on and says he corrupts them because by his nature he is a corrupting influence. And that's that's kind of the total of the story. I mean, it has somewhat of a completion to it, but there's a lot of talk about capital T truth in this story. Um, and he has somewhat of a reformation at the end and is sort of buoyed by this uh, experience. But that's kind of the short story in a nutshell. It's kind of a good way to think about it.
Right. And to cap off, to have like a better visual of like the ending, doesn't he go to find the girl?
Yeah. So in fact, the final little bit of the story, because this interaction with the girl is pivotal into him not at that moment when he comes home getting the revolver and ending it all. In fact, the final line is, and I did find that little girl, and I shall go on, and I shall go on. It's a 180 from the night before, when he had ran away from the girl, and but the girl is kind of the pivotal influence in a way into this dream that is the focus, the meat of the story.
Right. Well, yeah, I loved the sort of, well, personal kind of candidness. I mean, like, you could trust Dostoevsky to make a big point of explaining just how deep the sorrow can go in a human soul, sort of like he creates sort of like a symbol of how bad that nihilism can feel. And usually that's what he does, is he like makes a character of the nihilism itself, and poetically and sort of rambling, ends up describing the entirety of the feeling. But with this, it was way more personal. The character was an actual character instead of like a symbol, and um, that just boded so much nicer with me, because it made it feel like a story about a person, and that it was up to us to relate to it, not up to uh, the author to sort of make sure we understand. And with it being written at the end of his life, I guess that makes more sense, that he was more of a novelist by the end of his life and much less of a philosopher. Well, uh, um, a lot less concerned with philosophy in his writing and more concerned with the characters in his writing. I think you can even see that as a progression from from Karamazov to The Possessed to, I think you can kind of see that.
Yeah, I think that what I've noticed, because during this last couple of weeks I've had a bit of time to kind of read some of these. So I've read some of the shorter pieces, and this story is, I think, a lot more palatable than Notes from the Underground, for example. And they're very similar because you're introduced to this narrator who comes flat out and says they're, in this story, a ridiculous man, a madman. Early on in Notes from Underground, in fact, the first sort of third of it is just all takes place in him talking to you about what's going on in his head and what he envisions and what he feels. He taught the outsider influence, or the person that's kind of on the periphery of the situation and doesn't appear to have any friends and is kind of just locked into this cage of consciousness and his own thoughts and his own emotions. And they kind of all, I think, get twisted together, and they all sort of form his general either personality or his general outlook and just his being at some point, because you're talking about extreme figures our modern to our modern eyes and ears. We don't It does seem ridiculous that there can be people in these stories, not necessarily just described in this one, but like in White Nights, a short story of his, or The Double, people that are not respected. They don't really have friends, and generally people on the outside don't respect them. That creates this relationship of sort of resent and this feeling to either dominate them, and most of the time to feel dominated by others, even though there's less and less actual interaction, which I think in this story, that's why the little girl is such an important influence. It's the outside force, besides the people that the ridiculous man encounters in this dream, this tribe of primitive, beautiful people that are perfect in a lot of ways. They're sort of untouched by consciousness, and they're just
Right.
going about, and they're just set in their ways, and
They're
there's
way less
no,
conscious.
yeah, they're kind of unmolded or untouched, and unmanipulated, and they only know what they know, and it doesn't really extend beyond there. And that sort of touch of outside influence, I think, is a big parallel, because the girl touches his influence by, in some sense, either provoking the stream or making him reconsider or have these niggling questions that surface. He ends up doing to the unvarnished people, the beautiful children, as he calls them, and it has this damning effect to them. And then they began to admire the beauty of a lie, and they would say that they would become people that, oh, we do feel bad, we recognize we're doing these bad things, and we do feel very ashamed for them. I believe ashamed is the word they use, of shame. And but we'll just kind of carry on. We do feel awfully bad, but what else can we do? And that relationship is very interesting. And I would say, if you're, because we, full disclosure, Joe and I we've become interested in Dostoyevsky, and kind of what that has led to with the meaning of the works, the influences. I would suggest this story before Notes from Underground, because it pairs well, and this sort of gives an ending or something just to it, or some sort of resolution that a character has been influenced or changed, where Notes from the Underground is sort of the portrait of someone who is underground, and who is there, and there's no setting that straight. In a way, it's almost too far gone. He's too twisted into his own knots.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's sort of what I mean, is that there's like these, they're not caricatures, but a portrait is a great example, because it's a lack of like dynamic character. And that sort of ties into what a lot of people have problems with in 18th century literature, and especially Dostoevsky. I
19th
mean,
century, you mean? Sorry.
19th century, sorry, 1800s. And I had a good conversation about this with Gorev, my good friend, and he said something really similar. Exactly that the characters, they all seem like portraits. It's not so much a story of the human condition, but what a human is, and like those are two different things. They're and I mean, they meet a world of a difference when you're writing something, because um, yeah, it's not about the afflictions that come upon someone through their life. They're about the afflictions that we're innately born with, and or that we never recover from. And he always uses those sort of magnificent or sort of catastrophic changes in someone's life as as well, like lore, or like a um not an assumption, but something that's already there, and not something that you witness. I mean, you could argue that there are definitely plot points in things like the Karam and Brothers Karamazov, but it's not the same. It's very different. And the way that I kind of rephrased what Gorev was saying was that, and it seems like the point of reference for the author through each and every sentence creates sort of like a stable picture of what you're actually looking at. And you have him trying to explain every detail so that you understand exactly how the characters are responding to each other and what this means for the plot. But the problem with the writing is that it seems like everything else, everything not mentioned, if the characters are in a room, or if they're in a house, the entire world outside is on fire and it's being destroyed. And if they're in a room, the other rooms in the house are full of suitors and debauchery and just like death and chaos. And
Well, perfect example, if I'll just interject before you go on, is that there are only a couple other people that are described. In fact, someone else who lives kind of in the building in the dream of the ridiculous man. Um,
There's an old
but
lady and an officer.
yes, and the officer has his sort of evenings of debauchery, and it makes no difference to the ridiculous man. He's quite fine with it. What could bother him in these sorts of times? And that kind of ties into what you're saying.
Exactly. Exactly. But that's like a microcosm of what every Dostoevsky novel reads like. There is no order, and it's not just because of the style of writing, it's what the characters are doing, it's how they reference the outside world, it's how the third party, or I guess we talked about it as being sort of written in second person, the brothers Karamazov, as though it's mostly it seems like it's been manifested as an accumulation of rumors. And even all of these components of each piece leads to the sort of subconscious understanding that around every corner, which is vague and not described to the reader, there is a a naked widow starving to death, like all the time. it's it, it's crazy. And even, like, I mean, a small example which may be taken out of context because of uh I didn't finish the brothers Karamazov, is that as soon as Alyosha goes down a road past the monastery that we haven't seen him in before, he stumbles across those kids, and one of them bites him, and it's like, it's just like this. Any character which is not properly defined is a savage, and and they're ready to destroy their little part of the world. And these aren't just people in these stories. I mean, the acts of war, um uh where Ivan comes from. No, I'm thinking of the possessed. I'm thinking of the possessed, and the rich woman's son when he comes back from being in the military. Um, the way he responds after being exposed to his time in the war is like there's something that came in from the outside with him, and it's gnawing at the rest of society. It's ruining everything else.
Yeah, Stavrogan, when he returns, sees this sort of
That's right.
character that is, um, you're not sure how to take him. He doesn't seem as what is all on the surface. He acts, yet the actions are they're they're not even fully known, it seems, to Stavrogan why he does the movements or his actions, and why he does them.
Right.
It is it is a case of kind of creating more of a space between that sort of sense of self, and then what we don't know about ourselves. And when that increases, or when we feel that we're no longer in control in a way, and that we're slithering down a track that is both unfamiliar, and yet we can't seem to put the brakes on, and that kind of continues down the road. I think it's part of the slippery slope of nihilism that is a
Perfect.
big undergirding of a lot of different Dostoevsky stories.
Exactly. And it is exactly that. It's a very familiar theme. But in contrast, um, the ridiculous man, because it might be because the story is told in first person, or because we have a much better window into his mind than we did Stav Rogan, that we understand the subtlety of where his nihilism has come from, and it hasn't manifested into this big beast of the mountain or this demon of the mountain. It's like that's ready to like descend on the town. It's in his own heart, and that's sort of, I don't know if that speaks to the development of Dostoevsky's writing, but it certainly tells a story that that is much more easily digestible, because its philosophical context is put in the individual. And I I would definitely recommend starting this before you start Notes to the Underground.
Well, it's funny because you said heart, and that is where the character in the dream shoots himself, is in the heart. And that is a uncommon thing to do as far as suicides go. Most people
Yeah.
point here. And
Yes.
it's interesting because these are the type of characters that are eaten up inside their own thoughts of their no difference at all to me. There's nothing really matters. What's really real? Did all the events that happened before, are they real? And all the events after. So you're locked in this very mental struggle. Yet the character selects to shoot himself in the heart instead, and that speaks, I think, to your point about, although these characters are extreme characters, and over time they fall down this slope that gets harder and harder to kind of release from. But within it, there is always, even within Notes from the Underground, when talking about what are people? Men are not like piano keys. They will act despite themselves, and that there is something almost even outside of this that goes further into their actions. And to feel alive or something, they will act contrary, and that's part of some sort of people might describe as the human spirit, or the ways and how we just act is not all up here. We've established that. So where does part of it come from? And I think the
Well,
heart, the symbol of that in this story.
that's exactly right. Well, like when he first describes dreaming, well, I have a question to start. Does the dream end after he shoots himself in the heart?
No, no, the dream goes on. So
Okay, well, then that raises even more questions, because the way that he introduces the concept of dreams in the story is that it seems, I mean, I can pull it up. It seems as though they don't come from your brain. They seem to come from the pure desire, from what you want and from your heart. And so in some ways, symbolically, you would expect the dream to end if he was to rid himself of that limb, or that muscle, I guess. But
yeah, and so I'll just pick it up. This is from the story. Dreams, as we all know, are very curious things. Certain incidents in them are presented with quite uncanny vividness, each detail executed with the finishing touch of a jeweler, while others you leap across as though entirely unaware of, for instance, space and time. Dreams seem to be induced not by reason but by desire, not by the head but by the heart, and yet what clever tricks my reason is sometimes played on me in dreams. And then he goes on to describe how strange it was to fall asleep the way he does. And when he describes, so he's in the dream, he says, "For I had firmly resolved to shoot myself through the head, through the right temple to be precise. Having aimed the gun at my breast, I paused for a second or two, and suddenly my candle, the table, and the wall began moving and swaying before me. I fired quickly." And so what happens in the dream afterward is that he gets buried. He's buried in the earth, and he is left alone, entirely alone. He
like
lays
his
in his,
brother,
yes,
yeah.
and he does not expect anything, but he knows it's damp. He doesn't know how long time has passed, but water starts to seep through and slowly drip on his head, one drop every minute, he says. And then he starts to feel a bit of physical pain in it, and he starts to feel, because the water is hitting his wound. And then he goes on, he gets pulled through the grave by this being, and in fact he has he doesn't really know. He describes upon him, and him is capital H, and he unleashes this sort of this this very biblical type of cry that he's been damned or he forsaken. He says, "Whoever thou art, and if anything more rational exists than what is happening here, let it, I pray thee, come to pass here too. But if thou art revenging thyself for my senseless act of self-destruction by the infamy and absurdity of life after death, then know that no torture that may be inflicted upon me can ever equal the contempt which I shall go on feeling in silence, though my martyrdom last for eons upon eons." And
Jesus Christ.
right. So it's very, so he continues to be some flying through the air, being dragged by this being. He knows something's there, and he's trying to tell himself he's not afraid, and all of this. And he asks the question. He sees a star. "Is that Sirius?" he asks. And the being answers him and says, "No, that is the same star you saw between the clouds when you were coming home." The star upon that he knows that he is going to, that tonight is the night, as he says, tonight's the night I'm going to kill myself. Um, he says something very interesting to the being after this. Uh, just out of the blue, he says, "You know I'm afraid of you, and that's why you despise me," I said suddenly to my companion, unable to refrain from the humiliating remark with its implied admission, and feeling my own humiliation in my heart like the sharp prick of a needle. And he does not, the being does not answer him from there. But basically, they fly very close to the sun. Uh, and then he asks, "Where's the earth?" And the being points to where the earth is, and it's a little star twinkling with an emerald light. And from there, um, he says, "Well, I'll take you there." Essentially, the being says, "You will go there, and you shall see it all," answered my companion. And a strange sadness sounded in his voice. And he is flying closer and closer. He can recognize the oceans, the outlines of Europe. And then he starts to feel a great and sacred jealousy blazed up in my heart. And he starts to feel this sort of love of earth and this love of what all of it is. "We know not how to love otherwise. We know no other love. I want suffering in order to love. I want and thirst this very minute to kiss, with tears streaming down my cheeks, the one and only earth I have left behind. I don't want, I won't accept life on any other." And then he's standing on some sort of Greek set of islands or somewhere, and everything was just as it is with us, except that everything seemed to be bathed in the radiance of some public festival and of some great and holy triumph attained at last. And this is when he encounters the people that are there. And perhaps this is something we'll touch on. I know you'll like this. It's This story is steeped with the theme, the symbol of children. Children are a very strong element to this, because as soon as he describes these people, he says, "They came to me themselves, they surrounded me, they kissed me, children of the sun, children of the sun. Oh, how beautiful they were. Never on our earth had I beheld such beauty in man. Only perhaps in our children during the very first years of their life could one have found a remote, though faint, reflection of this beauty." And the description of children uh, comes up again uh, and again. But I talked for a bit.
Can I add a few things to
Yes,
this?
yes.
Um, the the uh, the use of children as a form or source of the beauty that he sees in life is is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I mean, there's a few things to tie this to. One of them is more of a recommendation, but um, we know that you transform.
Is it this? Do you want?
Yes, it
Because I
is.
picked out of the three metamorphoses from
Yes,
Nietzsche's
yes.
Zarathustra, what this pairs to. But
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Yeah, it's the camel and the lion and the child,
yeah.
and that rejuvenation back to forgetting what you have or forgetting what you've learned uh, to start the cycle back over is well, when it's written by Nietzsche, it's a negative connotation, or at least it comes across as negative, that there is something that's lost in this equation, that there's a moment of sort of like it's an exothermic and endothermic reaction. There's a buildup of knowledge and then power, and then it's released, right? um, but I, I I disagreed with that when I read it. I mean, and I think you're supposed to disagree. If Well, I mean, it depends on how you read it, because you know that it's much more beautiful than that. And my recommendation to finish off my points was that there is two pieces of well, there's one piece of music and a film that hits this part in your heart that is related to the feeling or the beauty that is in children. Um, there's a song. Well, first I'll start with the movie because I don't have to find something to reference it. The movie is oh, now I will have to reference it. Children of Men. Children of Men is a great movie about this. It's obviously the entire overarching plot is that there's no children being born, and so that beauty has been sucked out of the world. But the most beautiful moment in it is that at the end, after all is said and done, and the ending is not so um, dreary, that there to the credits is music or a sound, and it's children playing. And usually when the scene goes black and you know the credits are about to start, there's a few feelings that go on. But in no other movie have I ever felt that when I first started hearing those children playing, that the world was better after watching this movie. And it was such a, it's not intoxicating. It's like a spring breeze. It's like the snow melt. It's a lovely sound. And if you want to hear it uh, more honestly, the sound, not just to the visual of credits rolling, what you want to listen to is Wild Heart on Delta, which is Mumford and Sons' latest album, because they sing about a few themes which are actually relatively similar to what we're talking about now, mostly focusing around love, though, instead of life. And um, before the bridge and through the end of the song, there's the sound of children uh, playing. And I can't believe, I mean, as a young man who hasn't had kids yet, I can't wait for that to be part of the soundtrack of my life. I
Mm-hmm.
it it's yeah, I've been chewing on this idea for probably 3 weeks now, and that's going to be such an honor.
Well, what this story kind of brings about, and the way thing about it now is that you're kind of left in this circle that when you talk about the metamorphoses or changes, which these characters, these children of the sun, as they're called, end up going through by this influence, it's as if it's a Garden of Eden that no longer becomes is beautiful, because is the progression. The only way to advance is to shed this off, uh, in a way. But this feeling of love carries through, and it starts in the fifth chapter with, uh, yes, yes, it ended in my corrupting them all. How it could have happened, I do not know, but I remember it clearly. And he goes on and says, and yet, if they could have, in one way or another, returned to the state of happy innocence they had lost, and if someone had shown it to them again and had asked them whether they desired to go back to it, they would have most certainly refused. The answer they gave me was, what if we are dishonest, cruel, and unjust? We know it, and we are sorry for it, and we torment ourselves for it, and inflict pain upon ourselves, and punish ourselves more perhaps than the merciful judge who will judge us, and whose name we do not know. But we have science, and with its aid we shall again discover truth, though we shall accept it only when we perceive it with our reason. Knowledge is higher than feeling, and the consciousness of life is higher than life. Science will give us wisdom. Wisdom will reveal to us the laws, and the knowledge of the laws of happiness is higher than happiness. And this is something that he says we must fight against, this knowledge of the laws, as opposed to the actual the feelings of them, what they are to us, how they hit us, instead of understanding how they work. I've beheld it, the truth. It is not as though I had invented it with my mind. I've beheld it. I've beheld it. And the living image of it has filled my soul forever. I beheld it in all its glory, and I cannot believe that it cannot exist among men. So how can I grow muddled and confused? I shall, of course, lose my way, and am afraid that now and again I may speak with words that are not my own, but not for long. The living image of what I beheld will always be with me, and it will always correct me and lead me back onto the right path. And he
That's
goes
the metaphor.
on.
That's
This
the
is,
metamorphosis.
yes, yes. So the main thing is to love your neighbors yourself. That is the main thing, and that is everything, for nothing else matters. Once you do that, you will discover at once how everything can be arranged. And yet it is an old truth, a truth that has been told over and over and over again. But in spite of that, it finds no place among men. The consciousness of life is higher than life. The knowledge of happiness is higher than happiness. That is what we have to fight against. And I shall fight against it. If only we all wanted it, everything could be arranged immediately. And I did find that little girl, and I shall go on. I shall go on. And that is how the story ends. And it's um,
On the words of Jesus Christ? What the hell? I would not have. I would not have expected that.
right. And so it plays this very much this circular element of, I mean, nothing's really changed. Nothing's really different. He wakes up the next morning, but the little girl is still there. He says he found her, and now there's a rejuvenation, but in some ways a feeling that he can't shake off. That he knows it too well, and he's felt it, and nothing else can convince him. There's no dealing with the rational mind when you've felt these things, when you've seen them, when you've experienced them.
Wonderful. That's perfect end. I There's nothing more to add. What I will add, I suppose, is that in our next meeting, I will give you an update as to um, that I finished that and half read the next thing. So I will happily, if we are going to be this productive, I will happily sit 3/4 or half a step behind you in all of this, just so that we can, just so
Well,
that
should we touch on we mentioned the metamorphoses that Nietzsche writes about? Should we read them?
yes, that would be right.
Because I've got them here, and it just sort of compares, because um, this is one thing that Nietzsche really picked up on from Dostoevsky is this description of children, and it's the start of Zarathustra's discourses from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is essentially Nietzsche's parody of the New Testament and his own hero. So this is kind of his gospels in a way. So of the three metamorphoses, I name you three metamorphoses of the spirit, how the spirit shall become a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. There are many heavy things for the spirit, for the strong, weight-bearing spirit in which dwell respect and awe. Its strength longs for the heavy, for the heaviest. What is heavy? Thus asks the weight-bearing spirit. Thus it kneels down like the camel and wants to be well laden. What is the heaviest thing, you heroes? So asks the weight-bearing spirit, that I may take it upon me and rejoice in my strength. Is it not this? To debase yourself in order to injure your pride, to let your folly shine out in order to mock your wisdom? I want to stop there because to debase yourself, or Dostoevsky's stories often deal with humiliation and feeling humiliated by other people's. And not only that, but when you have these stories of the narrators, which are common in his shorter works, often these characters, by their own interpretations of life analysis, they end up debasing themselves. They view themselves as inferior to others, and then becomes this quest to dominate, but knowing that there will be just in the end, they will be humiliated and then debase themselves more upon. Is it
And
not this, to debase yourself in order to injure your pride, to let your folly shine out in order to mock your wisdom? Or is it this, to desert our cause when it is celebrating its victory, to climb high mountains in order to tempt the tempter? Or is it this, to feed upon the acorns and grass of knowledge and for the sake of truth to suffer hunger of the soul? Or is it this, to be sick and to send away comforters and make friends with the deaf who never hear what you ask? Or is it this, to wade into dirty water when it is the water of truth and not to disdain cold frogs and hot toads? Or is it this, to love those who despise us and to offer our hand to the ghost when it wants to frighten us? The weight bearing spirit takes upon itself all these heaviest things, like a camel hurrying laden into the desert. Thus it hurries into its desert. But in the loneliest desert, the second metamorphosis occurs. The spirit here becomes a lion. It wants to capture freedom and be lord in its own desert. It seeks here its ultimate Lord. It will be an enemy to him and to its ultimate God. It will struggle for victory with the great dragon. What is the great dragon which the spirit no longer wants to call Lord and God? The great dragon is called Thou shalt, but the spirit of the lion says, I will. Thou shalt lies in its path, sparkling with gold, a scale covered beast, and on every scale glitters golden, Thou shalt. Values of 1,000 years glitter on the scales, and thus speaks the mightiest of all dragons. All the values of things glitter on me. All values have already been created, and all created values are in me. Truly, there shall be no more I will, thus speaks the dragon. My brothers, why is the lion needed in the spirit? Why does the beast of burden that renounces and is reverent not suffice? To create new values, even the lion is incapable of that. But to create itself freedom for new creation, that the might of the lion can do. To create freedom for itself and a sacred no, even to duty, the lion is needed for that, my brothers. To seize the right to new values, that is the most terrible proceeding for a weight bearing and reverential spirit. Truly, to this spirit, it is a theft and a work for an animal of prey. Once it is loved, this thou shalt as its holiest thing. Now it has to find illusion and caprice even in the holiest, that it may steal freedom from its love. The lion is needed for this theft. But tell me, my brothers, what can the child do that even the lion cannot? Why must the praying lion still become a child? The child is innocence and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a sport, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion, a sacred yes. Yes, a sacred yes is needed, my brothers, for the sport of creation. The spirit now wills its own will. The spirit sundered from the world now wins its own world. I have named you three metamorphoses of the spirit, how the spirit became a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. Thus spoke Zarathustra, and at that time he was living in a town called the Pied Cow.